Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to UPSC IAS. Welcome to the Hindu Daily News Analysis. So let's begin the discussion by first looking at the topics. With this, let us take a look at the topics covered in today's The Hindu News Analysis. I have chosen 9 important articles from the daily edition of the Hindu newspaper. There are 3 articles which requires a detailed discussion for mains point of view and 6 more articles that are relevant for prelims exam. So let's cover these topics one by one. If you guys liking the initiative, why don't you like the video and subscribe our channel for more updates. By looking at the first article, Stop the Fence Sitting in Cluster Bomb Use. In this column, the writer is talking about cluster bomb or cluster munitions. And the threat posed by cluster munitions. First, let's understand in what context the article is in news and what are cluster munitions, and we will talk on convention on cluster munitions. The reason why the topic is in news is because as part of US Russia-Ukraine conflict, the United States that is supplying the weapons and providing financial aid to Ukraine has recently announced that it is going to send the cluster munition to Ukraine as a part of new military package to bolster Kyiv's war effort against Russia has racked up controversy. In fact, since the war began in February 2022, there have been many documented instances where Russia have already used cluster bomb against the Ukrainian cities. So as a part of counter retaliation, US is assisting the Ukraine on this as a part of military aid, which Ukrainian forces also started using against the Russian forces. The later use of the nuclear bombs, which is prohibited in the nuclear laws, has triggered a major controversy. So in this context, first let us know what is cluster munitions or cluster bombs. The cluster bombs release a multiple explosive submunitions, also called bomblets, into the air. Essentially, it is one large canister. It is either fired by an artillery gun that is based on land, or it could be released by a fighter jet directly in the air. Such a cluster bomb canister, once it opens up, it releases multiple bomblets. The cluster bomb, which contains about 200 explosive submunitions, which are released and spread out over a large area. So this kind of releasing a bomb on an entire area is called also called as carpet bombing, because so this kind of multiple explosive submunitions spread out over a large areas. So this kind of usage of weapons is highly controversial and subject to controversy, and it's considered an illegal and highly controversial against the international law. So such bombs cause such an indiscriminate damage. Such bombs are not targeted. They are not only targeting the military side, but also number of civilians and combatants. They even end up in the killing of hundreds and thousands of civilians, which is the case of disproportionate use of the case. Is that clear? is also such a use of bombs tends to tend to have a very high dead rate, meaning the several or the bomblets they fall on the ground but not detonate. They don't blow up instantly, remain dormant for several years in the battlefield. Is that clear? Like some of the firecrackers used in Diwali, which do not explode, remain dormant like that. So the concern here is that such dormant bomblets which are spread out in the battlefield, they eventually become like landmines. Even in the future, very many years after the war has ended, even after the decades after the war has ended, especially the civilian population, including women and children for a long time, affects the women and children for a long time. Such like a land mines, the whole areas mined like a land mines. Especially the vulnerability of the women and children's are indiscriminate use of these weapons. Due to this long-term risk posed by this kind of bombs, Human Rights Watch, according to which the civilian society organizations of Russia launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine has used the cluster bomb against Ukraine in cities such as Kharkiv. The worst part is that it have long-term impact. Because of the huge dead rate, some bombs are not explode, remains dormant and explode in future, which pose a permanent threat to the civilian populations. So now Ukraine is getting the dangerous weapon now get into the controversy, as it is dangerous worsens the situations. As I have already said you, Russia's already used this kind of bombs, latently attacked the cities like Kharkiv with this cluster bombs, and hundreds of civilians get damaged. But this is no justification to use the cluster bomb against the civilians. So that's why the writer take a balanced stand on the issue and write, and he is calling for complete elimination of the cluster munitions in the world. Yes, Russia have already used this kind of deadly bombs, but US is supplying to Ukraine heightens the issues. The writer is calling for complete elimination of this cluster munitions. This kind of bombs are used in the Second World War. During the Second World War conflict time, there is a widespread usage of this cluster munitions, particularly the European theatre of conflicts. Later, major powers like United States, they have used their cluster bombs in all types of conflicts. During the Vietnam War and the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, carpet bombing was the preferred practice by the US and the NATO alliance. Any other countries that have used their cluster bombs was in conflicts. According to Cluster Munition Monitor, which is a human rights organization, keeps track of the threats posed by cluster bombs. It has estimated that since the 1960s, 56,000 to 86,000 people have died in the cluster munition affected countries. So that is the devastating issues of these bombs. So to tackle the threat, several countries came together and adopted a global convention. We have a convention in place, the Convention on Cluster Munition, that prohibits the usage of cluster bombs, and it also prohibits the production, storage, transfer. Those countries which sign and ratify the convention become a party to it. They will have a legal obligation under the international law to not produce the cluster bomb. To not produce the stockpile the transfer and transfer the bombs, and not to use them in the conflict. But however, this obligation applies only to the parties who have signed and ratified the convention. It establishes a framework as well. It's a legally binding framework, and to put in place the victim assistance, the clearance of the contamination sites, and the risk reduction in the stockpiling and the stockpiling of this destructions. These are the legally parties have to do it for. That is, it is a clear it's a legal obligation taken by the parties to completely destruct the kind of cluster weapons they are keeping. So they are not only using but also stockpiling, and also stop the transfer and production, and also the stockpiling of this cluster munitions. So they are definitely they are definitely not to use in the so they are definitely prohibited from using it in conflicts. So they also need to create the victim support programs. For the recovery, they need to be financially assisted by the country. And also, if the country is using the if the country is containing any contaminated sites, that means war area, the death rate, that is the dormant bomb, should be removed by the country itself. And also to create awareness among the civilian population to to make awareness about the presence of the dormant bombs in the sites, so that people don't accidentally trip on them. These are the legal commitments and legal obligations. Those countries which are signed and ratified the convention. But the concern here is that major military powers have not signed and ratified the convention on cluster munitions. See, this convention was adopted in the year of 2008 in Dublin and came into force in 2010. As per the latest data, the 123 states are committed to the goal of the convention, and 111 states have ratified it, and 12 states that have signed the convention but not yet ratified it. Though the convention have the lot of support, but it's not universal, not universally adopted, meaning the many countries like US, Russia, Israel, Ukraine have not signed that. 25 out of 32 NATO members are signatories to the convention, though the major powers like US, Russia, China, India, Israel, even Ukraine have not signed it. Neither Ukraine, Russia nor the US have signed the treaty. That you have to keep in mind. So as a result, these countries are not under the international obligations. That is what they claim, at least. For example, Russia, if it used cluster bomb against Ukraine, when criticized, Russia says it says that it's not a party to the convention. As Russia-Ukraine says that it is not a party to the convention, and it is not breaking it's not breaking the international law by using this cluster bombs. This was the argument of the Russia. And now even Ukraine and the US making the same argument. They are saying that the US is not breaking the international law by transferring the cluster bombs to the to Ukraine. To begin with, US and Ukraine is not a party to the convention. The Ukraine also having the same defense, saying that it is using the cluster bombs because Russia was also used it, and we are not party to the convention on the cluster ammunitions. So, given this argument, the non-parties to the convention, the writer is saying that these countries are forgetting something called customary international law. The customary international law are part of customary international norms which are accepted and to be followed by all the countries, irrespective of whether they are signed, ratified, or adopted these international norms. There are two specific provisions the writer is highlighting. The prohibition of cluster bombs gets covered as a part of customary international law and thereby become the legal international obligation. Every country, irrespective of whether they have signed the convention or not. The writer is pointing out to the Article 51, Part 4 of the Additional Protocol 1 to the 1949 Geneva Convention, to which both Russia and Ukraine are parties. The Geneva Convention deals with the rules of engagement in the war. It deals with war crimes, international conventions, war crimes and the human rights violations in the conflict. This set of conventions are followed after the Second World War. Under this article, there is a provision which says the prohibition of indiscriminate attack. According to the additional protocol 1 of this article, a very important one is that the prohibition of the indiscriminate use of the attacks. It doesn't matter whether you are party to it or not. It applies universally to every country. Is that clear? If any conflict, in any conflict, the military force is expected to distinguish between the combatants and the civilians. Under the international law, it distinguishes between the civilian targets like cities, etc., and the military targets like military base, etc. In any conflict, it is an international obligation. It's international law on armed conflict has to distinguish between whether it is a civilian target or military one. So, as per customary international law laid off under Geneva Convention, armed forces are prohibited to use the indiscriminate attacks on the civilian targets. So, according to this writer, he is saying if any country that is violating the Article 51 Class 4, it is illegal to use this kind of cluster bombs against the indiscriminate use between the combatants and the civilians, irrespective of the countries whether signed or ratified the convention or not. So the argument of Russia, Ukraine, US are not valid. Even though they are not party to the convention, it is the customary international law which is obligatory on every country. So you must discriminate between the civilians and the combatants. In times of war, you can't target the civilian population just like the way you target the military forces. It is clearly prohibited and termed as illegal. That is why the writer is pointing out the usage of cluster bombs is illegal under the international law, irrespective of the countries whether party to the convention or not. He is also saying another important point. Under Article 51, Class 5, Additional Protocol 1 of 1949 Geneva Convention, the rule prohibits the excessive use of forces that cause the incidental damage to the civilian population when compared to the military benefits anticipated. Additional thing is that the principle here should the customary law contains an principle, that is the use of force on the principle of proportionality. What it means, the threat and the objective of the attack. Depending upon the extent of the threat, depending upon the stated military objectives, they have to use a proportional military force in the war or conflict. This is also seen as a part of customary international law. Even the use of the cluster bomb is in the amount of disproportionate use of the force is considered to be illegal according to this customary international law, irrespective of the country has signed the convention or not. So this is the argument the writer is bringing up. So the defense the US is providing is not valid. Just because it's not a party to the convention doesn't mean it doesn't have any other international obligations. So he is pointing out the article 51 clause 4 and 5 of the additional protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention. The using of cluster bomb is indiscriminate against the civilians. It is the case of disproportionate use of forces against the civilians, and this is the breach of human rights, and also it is a breach of international law. So based on this argument is asking the Russia and Ukraine to follow the international law. When coming to United States, is it violates any international law? Is it transfers only it only transfer the nuclear cluster bombs. Legally speaking, US will not be in violation. I will explain why. See, US, Russia, Ukraine all three are not party to the convention. But who is using the cluster bombs? Eventually, it is Russia and Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine will breach the customary international law under Geneva Convention. If they use the cluster bombs, it's indiscriminate and disproportionate according to the customary law. See, here US is not using the cluster bomb. It's simply transferring the cluster bombs. So, there is no customary international law that prohibits the transfer of nuclear weapons. So legally speaking, the US is not violating any international law by transferring cluster bomb to Ukraine. See, both were parties to the convention that were different case. The transfer of cluster bomb should be prohibited, right? If they are doing it, that would be illegal. But now that is not the case. US is not breaking any international law because both the US and Ukraine are not party to the convention, and also there is no customary international law that prohibits the transfer of the cluster bombs. So technically speaking, US is not violating any international law, but however the writer says this is not an excuse to show such irresponsible behavior. So he is saying any forces that were using should be proportional and discriminate. The use of military forces not against civilians, against combatants, not against civilians. So that's why he is urging all the United States to urges all the United States members to work together to completely eliminate the cluster bombs at the face of the earth. It needs to be universal. The author is urging to say that by adoption globally, by universal adoption of the convention by the countries. So he is urging the United Nations and all the member countries to adopt it universally, and who are not party to it to sign and to sign it. If you see the other NATO alliance like Germany and other NATO countries are party to it. It signed the convention already. So they no longer use or produce or stockpile this cluster bombs. So these countries should push the other countries like major powers like Russia, Ukraine, India, US to adopt the convention and to get rid of the cluster bombs out of the earth. So this is the writers this is what the writers saying in this article, as it is he is arguing for the content is relevant to GS paper 2, that is more important.